and welcome to another episode of History with a Drag Queen, starring me, your host, Karla Marks. Look at this beautiful surrounding we have. What opulence and glamour! Well, if you have been traveling around Europe, you might be familiar with this. This background behind me is from the Palace of Versailles, just outside Paris, and it is the Hall of Mirrors, the famous seat of French power. Why am I here? Because today we're going to talk about the First World War. Now, I know you say, hey, haven't we talked about how that started? We sure have. But what we're going to talk about is something that is often not fully understood. Why did it end up the way that it did? Why most people know things about the First World War are that there were trenches, that there was a stalemate, that ain't nobody went anywhere for 4 years. So why did this happen? So that's what we're going to dive into today. Why did the First World War develop trenches, and why did it take so long to figure this out? Okay, so when we get into trench warfare, it's a deadlock. Nobody's going anywhere. They're stuck. And the biggest myth that really exists about this is the idea of lions led by donkeys, which is maybe like the First World War version of like tops and bottoms, but it's not. What it actually means is the idea that all of the brave young soldiers in the trenches were courageous lions. And that all of the generals who were leading them were donkeys or asses. I'm not doing a donkey noise. And so the idea is that, the courageous young men were doing their part, but the generals, they had no idea and they were just screwing it up. And, the first couple of months there was a little bit of that. There was a whole host of generals who had kind of been sitting around for 15, 20 years that just had been drinking port and, were good at marching in uniforms and not upsetting politicians. And so that's what they kind of did. And so they just existed in the army for a long time. First World War breaks out. Oh boy, this is a serious war. It's modern, it's industrial, and it's fast. And so some of these guys get kicked out of the army really quickly. But by the time 1915 goes, these are pretty much professional armies facing off toe-to-toe, more or less. So did they really just not understand the war, or was something else going on? Well, I guess I'll just answer that now. There was something else going on. And that was that the trenches were a deadlock that was really, really difficult to crack. Why? Well, the Germans were actually doing a lot of aggressive action that we don't normally think about in the Western world. When we think of Canada, the United States, Britain, when we talk about the war, we talk about deadlock. That's true on the Western front. On the Eastern front, the Germans and the Russians were having this huge back and forth. And so the Germans decided to sit on the defensive in the Western front. Okay, that's the front we're going to talk about. So what were they doing? Well, they did this thing called defense in depth. And so they created a whole interlocking system of trenches. What they did was they created a first trench system. There's like 3 little trenches. That's the first trench system. Then there's the second trench system. There's a whole bunch of little trenches there. And then way in the back, there's a third trench system. Okay, so 3 belts, which, like, if you're accessorizing, could be a little bit much. But hey, like, the 80s, 90s are coming back, so maybe, wear as many belts as you want. The Germans, they wore 3. And they had interlocking fields of fire, so wherever you tried to attack the front, you were getting shot at from multiple angles. Not great. You're basically like a girl on Instagram that just announced that you broke up with somebody. You're under fire from all different angles. It's not working out well for you. Okay, and then what the Germans did was they were like, mein dudes, we've noticed that the Allies keep shelling our first trench. Maybe we should not keep a lot of guys there. So they didn't. They actually only had 10% of their forces in the first trench system. They had 20% in the second trench system. And then everybody else was just hanging out in the back. So 70% of the German army was just hanging out in the third trench system, which was nowhere near the Allied guns. So the Allies are firing. Those are my sound effects. If you don't like them, give me more money for a budget. And so they're shooting. The Germans were totally safe. They're way back there. They were totally fine. They're just like, okay. Then the other thing that they did was they were like, well, what if we came up with a lateral defense? And so they built rail lines to connect all the different trench systems. So if a quiet sector was just hanging out and 10 miles down the road, some Germans are like, whoa, we're getting attacked. They could radio and get help from quiet sectors. So it meant that to try and break through one sector, you actually really had to try to break through all the sectors simultaneously. It made it even harder than it really could have been in just one isolated bit. So the Germans used a system called defense in depth. It meant that most of the defenders were spread out over huge territories, and we're talking like 16 kilometers deep of defensive systems. So, it wasn't just like, hey, we just got to take that trench and we're off to the races. That's what they were hoping. It didn't happen that way. It was really, really deep. Okay. Now, if I do this right through the miracle of technology, you're going to see some images here, and we're going to show you the defense in depth. Feast your eyes. Okay, and then the other thing we're going to show you is all the different ways that people tried to get through. So when I'm teaching this class, what I like to usually do is say, well, would you break through? It's 1916. Let's try all the different ways. You're a general. What do you got? Break through the trench system. And then I sit back and basically bat down every one of their ideas because I know this stuff really well. Okay, so let's talk about some things that they tried. Well, the one that a lot of people say is, well, why not mine them? Why not dig underneath and blow up the trenches? The Allies did that. They tried that. The French took in guys called sappers. The military has a new word for everything. They're just guys who dig tunnels and put bombs underneath shit. They tried it. They blew stuff up. It was the biggest explosion in human history up until that point in time. It was so powerful that when they set out these explosives in France, it rattled the window panes in London. Problem was, the detonation was so huge that when the Allies were like, let's go march into German territory, they were like, wait, where are we? It blew up every landmark. All the trench systems were so disorganized that they had no idea where to go. And the other problem was that the Germans were like, hey, you know what that giant crater looks like? What? Trench. So the Germans just reinforced the shell craters, and they were like, well, let's just hang out in here, put a machine gun, and we can use this like a trench. And they did. So it didn't really help the attacking forces as much as they might thought. Okay. Gas. Let's use gas. Well, it's actually the Germans that use gas first. And what they figure out is that gas really only worked once, and nobody really thought it would, so they didn't really commit a lot of troops to the attack. And then the second time, they're like, let's do it. But the second time, people were like, yeah, we get it. It's gas. It sucks. Could you fart outside somewhere else? Okay, well, gas was a lot more deadly than that. But by 1915, 1916, actually not a lot of people are dying from gas in the trenches. Most countries rapidly produced gas masks and ways of breathing. They had alarm bells and systems to warn everyone to get gas masked up really quickly. So really the only thing that happened was that people were really uncomfortable. And you're like, great, I have to sit in a gas mask for the next 2 days. Cool, thanks. Not a lot of guys are actually dying from gas, and certainly not enough people to create a massive breakthrough. And that's the problem, is that even if something works on a small scale, remember that defense in depth I talked to you about? You have to create a massive breakthrough to get to open ground to maybe start gobbling up these trench systems. Okay, why don't we just go around it? Great idea. They tried it. They really did. In 1914, the two armies came crashing together in September, and they met at this Battle of the Marne, and everyone was like, whoa, what do we do now? It was a stalemate. And the Germans came up with a plan, like, what if we go to the right? And so they tried to go around. And then the French were like, oh, I see what you're doing there. I will go around to the left. And they just did this, where one goes around there, the other goes around this. And then around, and around, and around, and around. And then they hit the ocean. It's a continuous front. The front in the First World War went all the way from the very tip of the coast of the English Channel all the way to the mountains of Switzerland. And if you've ever been to Banff, you don't really want to walk through those mountains while someone's shooting at you from the top. So nobody's going through there. So it's a complete stalemate. You cannot go around. They tried it. Doesn't work. Okay. What about air power? They created air power. Planes were flying around. Okay, these are not modern planes. They are made of like balsa wood. You know, like the little models you make and go, pew. That's basically what these guys were flying around in. The first planes didn't even have guns on them. Literally, guys were with a pistol like at each other. It's not really a modern effective tool. When they had bombs to bomb people, they literally had to take Zee Bomb, untie it from the side of the plane, light it with a lighter, and then drop it. It's about this big. It's not really going to do a lot of damage. They also don't have that many planes. Air power is in its infancy. it's not going to work. Okay, so air power is just not there as a weapon that can really create a massive battlefield advantage in the First World War. Tanks. Eh? Tanks? Tanks? Who doesn't love a good tank? I love tank tops. Firstly, I think all tops must be cropped, but you do you. So did tanks work? Well, no, they didn't. In the Second World War, tanks are a big deal. They're fast, they're armored, they have guns. In the First World War, the old joke is that they're kind of like a roommate you really don't want. They're slow, they're ugly, and they smell really bad. Tanks were first created by the British Army, and they were supposed to be deployed sometime in 1916, 1917. Well, Douglas Haig, who was in charge of the British Expeditionary Force, had a big battle going at the Somme in the middle of 1916. And it didn't go very well. 20,000 guys died in day one. 65,000 people got shot, killed, or wounded on the first day. Shit! Okay, so the battle's going on for a couple more weeks and months, and Haig is desperate, and he's looking for anything to do to make a big breakthrough and make good on his promise that he'd win the war. And there's this secret project coming along, and that's why tanks are called tanks. They actually hid them from German spies, potentially, by giving it a code name, a tank, and hid it in a naval war department so that nobody would have any idea that it was a land craft. So we call them tanks when it's actually just like a weird code word that they came up with to try and confuse German spies, but they're called tanks now. It stuck. So they created tanks, but they created them in these small, they were very fragile, they broke down a lot, engines were not what they are now, they couldn't carry a lot of guys, and they were quite thin-skinned, so you could shoot through them pretty easily. But they made about 30 of them. And the guy who created the tank was like, dude, hold off. He's like, you should use these when we've got like hundreds of tanks. And Haig was desperate. And he said, screw it. We have this weapon. We're going to use it. So he threw in 30 tanks. Of those 30 tanks, 27 of them broke down before they reached enemy lines. The 3 that made it, though, caused massive panic. And the Germans freaked out because they were like, what is this thing? We're screwed. Eventually, they broke down, the Germans shot them enough, and they neutralized the threat. But what they did was they looked at it and they took these the British tanks, and the Germans figured out ways to slow them down and break them up. And the problem is that the next time they were used, they didn't have the shock value. Germans weren't scared of them. They're like, okay, this is the tank, this is the procedure we follow, we'll be fine. So they were committed too early, and they're not the same kind of tanks that you think of in the Second World War. They're just not as combat effective. All of this leads to a stalemate. There's no effective way through. Compounding the problem of why did this take so long to figure out is armies are really big. There are millions of men fighting each other in the First World War, and to convince someone to try something new took months. And then it took months to train people and then try it. And then if you tried it and it didn't work, did you instantly throw the idea out? No, you would say, okay, well, maybe, this screwed up, or maybe they just caught it. Let's try it again. You tried a couple of times before you're sure that it didn't work. Years have gone by now. Thousands of guys have died. And the stalemate drags out longer and longer and longer and longer. So that's kind of why it's a little bit harsh to say that the generals in the First World War were inept. It is definitely fair to say that they were pretty callous, and they did not show an adequate appreciation for the lives of the men that were fighting under them, that they kind of threw away quite frivolously. What other ideas did they have? It was really hard to do. There wasn't really an easy fix, and trying to find these solutions was really tough. So this is why there was a deadlock in the First World War. How did the deadlock end? I think we'll save that one for another video. Thank you so much for watching. I am Karla Marks, your stalwart host. I am so happy to be doing this series. Thank you so much for following along. For any financial contributions, there's a PayPal link and an e-transfer link below if you're in the financial ability to do that. If not, that's okay. If you can, do me a favor. Like, comment, share, subscribe. I appreciate all of that so much. It helps me get the word out. And as always, if you have a topic that you are dying to see History with a Drag Queen cover, please bang it in the comments. I'd be happy to take a look at it and completely dismiss your ideas. Just kidding. I always love suggestions. I would be really excited to see any suggestions you have. So thank you so much for watching. You are all very, very lovely. Have a great day.